Okay, welcome back. We are in our second session, and this is the session that is kind of split into two parts. So you'll notice I've called this one 2.1. This session will discuss scholarship and theory and some psychology. And in the next part of this session, we will get hands-on and we'll look at curriculum design for creating learning continuums and creating units of study. So I hope that you are still with me after that first session. I think this session, number 2.1 and 2.2, will feel like a bit of a roller coaster. We're going to go in some places you've maybe never been in education. And it might feel uncomfortable. It might feel annoying. It might feel frustrating, but I need you to take a risk with me. Being a teacher requires taking a risk. And with that in mind, you'll have to fasten your seatbelt and maybe be patient. But I really hope that by the time we make it to the last session, our fourth session, that it will be like wrapping up a good book that we can, just do our best to understand. But here's where we're going. Let's get started here. This is a sample learning continuum. It's tough to read, but if you look in your notes that I've provided, you can take a closer look. But in the column that says clarifying proficiency, it says, how will we know that we've reached our goal? And there I've set a goal. It's in blue. My goal of these 4 sessions is to comprehend standard-based learning continuums for mathematics. And to clarify what that means, I can say, well, this means that I can clarify the problems associated with percentages. That's what I hope you can do. I hope you can explain learning continuums for mathematics with explicit learning targets, include define extension, and show how proficiency scale can be used for assessment and reporting. That's what how I've defined our learning goal. And if you look in green, that's what we've done in the last session. We observed why percentages are problematic assessment practices, and we addressed those 3 green questions. And then today we're going to look at recognizing explicit learning targets and observing the creation of learning continuums for mathematics. In a moment, we're going to recall this vignette from our previous session, but I would like to give a short precursor. And I just want to know that maybe you are a percentage person and maybe you felt convicted by the first session, or maybe you felt skeptical, but I just want to let you know that I have no intention in leaving us in idealism. I have so pushed back against what I would say is like more fluffy end of progressive education. I prefer concrete, useful ed psych and progressive education that can move us forward. And I remember feeling skeptical when my ideas were challenged. I came to work at this school. There's a lot of forward-thinking people, and I had just finished my practicum. I was in my first year of teaching, and I just ever so often I would say, I'm not sure about that. We'd be talking about using learning targets or using a 4-point assessment scale. And I'd say, I just don't know about that. I don't know about that. I don't know about that. And if you're feeling skeptical, I just want to know that I was there too. I totally was. And what I needed to do was I needed to kind of parse the wheat from the chaff, because what people were talking to me, some of it made sense and some of it didn't. And some of it was really good and some of it wasn't. So part of going through these sessions is trying to find the best concrete, useful alternative to percentages that I can find. And know that after years of collaborating and investigating with my colleagues and refining my own practice, like I came to be strongly convinced by what I'm going to share with you today. This is deeply embedded in my practice. Recently, I switched grades. I was teaching 6th grade for a long time. Then I started teaching 8th grade. And when I started teaching 8th grade mathematics, I used this entire focus of framework for objectives, learning targets, learning objectives. This is what I've used, and it's been a game changer. Like, I can speak to that. So I hope that I'm not just saying percentages are bad and we need to do something else, because I'm not interested in a new iteration of education that has more loose ends than the one that I described in the first session. Not at all. So I hope that gives you a little bit of hope. And I want to invite you into a practice that has made my mathematics classroom richer, stronger, better. And I'd like to read 2 quotations to kind of inspire us today. They're both by Katie White and her book, Softening the Edges. I would recommend that you read that book. It's a fantastic book that'll help explicate. I'll be relying on it heavily on her work, as well as some of the work of the scholars in the previous session. But here is the first one. Katie White calls reshaping assessment practices, she calls it softening the edges, as opposed to hard edges that assessment has it, that we saw in the previous session with the percentages. But she says this: when the edges are softened in our assessment practices, we no longer feel boxed in or helpless, scrambling to defend a grade or explain a reporting decision, because we can take control of our assessment and instructional decisions that emerge from the information we gather. Imagine being the teacher in the previous session that gave 75% and their friend got 76. Imagine defending that decision because percentages are arbitrary. Or imagine giving this test, 15 out of 24, and defending that even though the student could problem solve darn well, they deserve a C minus or whatever the heck it is that this score is. And maybe you felt that way. Maybe you've given something and you're like, I'm not sure why this is the grade, but I'm giving it to you. This is supposed to be a hands-on, concrete way to take control of our curriculum design and assessment. Katie White has a lot to offer educators so that they feel comfortable, confident, and competent in their practice. She says this also: softening the edges is not about going easy on students. This is where I say this is not fluffy progressive education. It's not about going easy on students. It's not about reducing the rigor of the learning experiences we construct or offering bonus points or easy tasks. Instead, it's about having enough respect for our learners to ask as much of them as they can give. Make no mistake, our learners can give a great deal. The potential of our students is astounding when they are met with high expectations, engaging purposes, and clarity about the strategies and skills they are working to develop. This quotation is deeply in sync with my educational philosophy, and I hope it inspires you as well as we begin today's session. Here's the vignette from last time. This is the fraction operations test. You can see that the students scored for a point total 15 out of 24. And last time we took a look at this second section that gave us more information. If you recall from the last session, you'll see that the student, he or she forgot to divide fractions properly and use the reciprocal function in a useful way. And all of the other mathematics were done with care and pride. Even the problem solving, the higher level application thinking was done well. And yet the score reflects a C minus, which is quite low on the progression or gradations using letter grades. So 63% would reflect a poor performance, but the data maybe reflects differently. Let's compare with, I'm just going to add to this vignette. This is now a second student. Let's take a look at a second student. 19 out of 24, which is a higher score on this test, 4 points more than the student previous, and a higher letter grade as well. So you might want some more information. I'm going to try and hold back a little bit, but let's take a look here. What do you notice here about this student? Might notice right away this student jumped up higher than the other person, B plus versus C minus, 79%, almost 80%. You'll notice that multiplying, dividing, and adding and subtracting fractions, they had perfect solutions, and solving problems was a struggle. That's where they lost all of their points, to use the language of this system. If you need to ponder these further, I just remind you that they're in the notes that are provided in the link and perhaps in the handout as well. But let's discuss, who is the stronger student according to these learning goals? Has each student been assessed accurately? If you were given the opportunity to use functional subjective judgment in this situation, how might you augment or adjust the assessments? Think about these to yourself or discuss with people you are with, and then we will come back together and continue this discussion. Welcome back. Let's just do a bit of recalling from last time. Problematic assessment practices inhibit clarity. They suppose pure objectivity. They assume little margin for error, and they remove the focus on learning. They focus on earning, specifically with percentages. And before we can deal with any of these problems, we need to know that the foremost obstacle is teacher clarity. Last time we talked about John Hattie and his meta-analyses, that teacher clarity has a 0.75 effect size, which is extremely high. And if we go back to how we saw, if you look at the notes, how we broke down the test into sections, that increased clarity immediately. Like, we had a better idea as to where each student was. That one student just made a simple mistake on division and could apply their thinking. The other student could only do basic comprehension, and yet the percentages don't reflect that nuance. And that's important to know if we're really thinking about educational psychology and objectives, and how we can look at it on Bloom's taxonomy as a level of sophistication. One student that scored lower is actually a more sophisticated thinker, and we get that when we increase clarity and pivot from percentages. Once the point total is arranged by goal, you can actually see and address what each student has learned by each learning goal. Like, I can multiply fractions, I can divide fractions. And you start to see what a student has learned versus what a student has earned. You see, learning is always better than earning. So we're already on our way to improving these assessments. In the last session, I said, could we redeem this? And I think we're one step closer. And clarity is on the rise, and the focus to learning is on its way also. So that's two of these issues that we're starting to move towards. And we're embracing some functional subjective judgment. So I'd like to now show you the same test, and I'd like you to take a look at how I've assessed it. In the enrichment questions from yesterday, or not yesterday necessarily if you're watching this, but from the previous session, it said, hey, like, take a math test that has point totals and keep the math test, but get rid of the point totals and see, can you assess it without them? And how would you communicate it? Here's one way that I would consider trying that. We've still arranged it by goal, and there is anecdotal feedback per goal. So multiply fractions, well done. You can do it consistently. Divide fraction, it literally says, it seems like you've forgotten to use the reciprocal function. Forgot to flip and multiply. Add and subtract, you can do it consistently. And then problem solving, with the exception of division, you can do it. And then instead of a total, I have this comment that says your fraction operations are strong and you can apply your knowledge to problem solving. One area to improve is dividing fractions. So you might start to think, how do these anecdotal comments communicate better than the simple objective percentages? And then we can take a look at this second student. Here, you can multiply consistently, you can divide consistently, you can add and subtract consistently, but problem solving remains a challenge. You can solve basic problems, not advanced problems. That is, and that is not a long sentence to say. People are probably looking at this and saying, well, there's too many words. You can use different systems. You don't need to write full sentences or whatever, but this student can only do basic problems. That's something to make note of, not B+ or C-. So what are your immediate thoughts when looking at this new way, or my augmented version of these tests, when it comes to clarity, objectivity, potential error, and focus on learning? Discuss with the people around you, and then we'll resume the session. Feel free to pause the video. Okay, welcome back. Let's dive into some scholarship. Now, earlier, I mentioned that the organization of the test, opposed to one giant score, is what I would call a big step in the right direction, organizing by goal. And the organization increases clarity, but what it truly does is reframe the assessment in terms of goals or objectives or targets. Those three words can all be interchangeable, rather than one big topic. Like, remember the first one? It just said fraction operations, 15 out of 24. Well, what does that mean? Well, there's more topics there. There's more information there. And looking at individual goals allows the teacher to start to use functional subjective judgment, sometimes referred to as professional judgment, as I said in the first session, to accurately articulate where a student is at and what they have learned or what they have not learned. And you can comment on that. That refocuses assessment on learning rather than earning. And it also allows for potential errors to be communicated, as seen in the earlier vignettes. Information about what a student can do is more meaningful than just lumping a score together out of 24. That's really what you want to know. How is my kid doing in math? What can my kid do? You hear that all the time from parents, the never-ending question. And I have reasons for this, and I'd like to highlight some scholars. So the first one is Hilda Taba. Here, this is Hilda Taba's Framework for Education from 1971. You can take a look at it. It's or pause the video or take a look. It's also, you'll also find it in your notes. You see, when addressing what we'll call lowercase c curriculum, which is like the day-to-day academics or lesson planning that a student would encounter, reading, writing, arithmetic, capital C curriculum refers to every interaction that a student has in their K-12 life that shapes them in some regard. So Hilda Taba here creates an educational framework where objectives are at the center. And it's going to help us understand how to soften the edges or reshape our assessment practices, as Katie White puts it. You see, for Taba, all capital C curriculum and lowercase c curriculum, all of it goes through objectives at the center. And mathematics educators, we will benefit from shaping our curriculum and designing it with objectives or goals or targets in mind. We could replace that word, but keeping that in mind. And we've seen how that increases clarity. And as we saw my changed or augmented fractions test, when the sections were divided into objectives or targets, many educators like Katie White, as we'll talk about, we'll call them targets, we can identify those targets as I can statements. So I can do this, I can do that, I can multiply fractions, I can add or subtract fractions, I can solve problems using fraction operations. When we add that, we can explicitly reflect on how students have accomplished those goals or objectives. It's not just a score. It's actually a reflection on what they've learned. And that increases the clarity of our assessment. Right away, it's like, hey, a student can do this, they can't do that, instead of a student scored this. For students, it helps that they know exactly where their strengths and areas of growth lie. For many parents, they even when we try and communicate as best as we can, home to parents about like, here's your child's test score, could you sign this test please, that's ambiguous. But seeing a goal, a student can do this, struggling here, that will help us answer the never-ending question of how is my kid doing in math. This also takes the focus off of things like attendance and homework, because those aren't learning objectives. Those don't go through this framework. And when teachers need information about a student, they can know exactly where they're at because it's organized by goal. When you pull up the grade book and when you're at parent conferences, oh, could you remind me how my child is doing in math? You don't just give them a percentage or a number and say, well, they should work harder or earn some more points. You can say, well, I need them to still learn how to divide fractions. They've completely forgotten. It's much more specific and clear. Organizing by objectives and providing feedback and comments on those specific goals, that will trump an ambiguous percentage every single time. I can guarantee that. And I think this will aid our approach when considering the clarity that we need in assessment, using functional subjective judgment, and then also addressing margin for error and refocusing back on the learning. Let's move to a second scholar, Benjamin Bloom, the ever famous Benjamin Bloom and Bloom's taxonomy. Here is Bloom's taxonomy. This is called the Bloom's Taxonomy Teacher Planning Kit. My goodness, is this the most useful document that I have in my teaching arsenal? You'll find it in the notes and you'll find it at this website. And it's just fantastic. It's so fantastic. A colleague of mine shared this with me, and I'm happy to share it with you. It has totally transformed my curriculum design. So for Benjamin Bloom, the curriculum had a distinct focus on objectives. His book, 1956 book, where this taxonomy was introduced, you've maybe heard of this. This is 1956. It was called Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. So we need to go back almost. It's kind of funny. This is almost conservative thinking to go back. We need to refocus on goals and objectives. with our assessment, because objectives, they've been a sturdy foundation for educational practice. Percentages took teachers down a detour, and we need to bring it back here. What are students doing? Bloom's approach was a hierarchy of thinking. As we mentioned, the fractions test did not have all the same skill types. For example, like simple memory or knowledge tasks are easily outweighed by solving problems or applying what it is that students have learned. Bloom created this taxonomy that increases in complexity. And here you'll see a graphic that outlines each level of sophistication. But this specific teacher planning kit has key verbs or words that describe each level. And below are also questions that could be asked of students to perform at each level. This is, you need to take a closer look at this PDF. But zooming in, we can see that the levels, lower level thinking, knowledge, comprehension, and higher level thinking, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. These are, these can be this is a very helpful hierarchy of sophistication when it comes to understanding skills. You see, Bloom's hierarchy, or it remains essential for how we design curriculum and address learning. The fractions test, the original point total had nothing to do with what a student had learned. A C minus when a student was capable of application, it really does not, it's not congruent. So we need to really take Bloom's to heart. And not only do math educators need to refocus the curriculum design in terms of objectives, but they also need to be aware of what types of goals they're setting for students. And you may want to ask yourself where your current mathematical goals align on Bloom's taxonomy. And maybe you might think that students are capable of more or less. Maybe something is not falling in line or quite sinking in with you. But ponder this Bloom's taxonomy. Typically, mathematics units begin with simple knowledge, building on comprehension, and at the end with application. If there's time for the problem, the word problem section of the textbook, that's like a classic traditional math classroom practice you could potentially see. And tests often reflect a similar structure, but often fail in regards to the complexity. Everything is just equal, 1 point. And this is where we maybe need to embrace some functional subjective judgment, to embrace a specific goal at a specific level, and know that certain objectives are more difficult than others, and know that some might be extensions from learning goals that you have set previously. If we start to think through this lens, all of a sudden, we will have a better grasp on what it is that our students are supposed to be learning. Another scholar here, last scholar. Peter Liljedahl, Mathematics Education Genius. I recommend this book, you guys. I read it in just a couple weeks. It was so good, Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics. It's specifically like a teaching strategy book, but there's lots on assessment and curriculum design as well. And I would just like us to understand that clarity is of the foremost importance. And I'm sure that there are educators who still feel the need to provide a final grade or a homogenized grade, mark, or percentage. And I'm not against that entirely. Like, you may feel that while breaking down assessments by goal is helpful, but the fact remains you still need a final grade. And I understand the desire to want to sum it all up. Here's what we've learned in this unit. And I wouldn't say I'm entirely against it, especially like we're going to look at units that really focus on one goal. I think you could sum that up because it's just one goal. But if the strategy used to sum up the unit avoids amalgamation and averaging like percentages do, then we're on the right track. However, I'm a strong believer of smaller goals, and here's why. Liljedahl discusses in this book that students are more successful when they think about mathematics as subtopics. Overarching topics homogenize too much. And when you look at that, like the student that got 15 out of 24 on fractions, good grief, if they come home, they just say, I'm no good at fractions. And the parent says, well, can you order and compare the fractions? It says, yeah. Well, then I thought you're not good at fractions. Well, it's not that type of fractions. Well, can you add and subtract fractions? Yeah, I can do that. No problem. Well, what type of fractions? I thought you said you're no good at fractions. Well, that's what the test says. But if we break it down by goal, students know where they are strong and where they are growing to say, you know what, I can't divide fractions. I have to target that and get better at something like that. And then all of a sudden, if we think of learning as a ladder or steps, we can know which step is missing or what we have yet to jump up or at what part of the ladder we are at when we think of it as small goals. If we think of it as an overarching topic, it's just one big step. And of course, that's quite debilitating. So another reason to focus on sub goals or smaller goals, your students will be more successful. In sum, I'm going to wrap this part up. This is our scholarship before we take a break and do section 2.2, and we will get hands-on, and we're going to create a learning continuum or a unit of study that focuses on goals and building block those goals and avoid percentages. But in sum, or if it was too long and you didn't listen, reshaping our assessment practices is meant to maintain high expectations and academic rigor. A lofty goal of replacing an outdated educational staple, such as percentages, must be done with a novel practice that is of more educationally significant value. Can't just be fluff, has to be useful. Teacher focus must remain on objectives or goals or targets, which is an age-old research-based approach. Focusing on objectives immediately increases clarity and creates room for teachers to use their professional judgment to help communicate learning and be aware of potential errors. Focusing on objectives also brings students back to lapses in learning rather than absences of points. Let's take a break, and then the next video we will come back to wrap up curriculum design. Thank you and enjoy the break.